Hey everyone, welcome back to Boring History for Sleep. Tonight's story takes a quiet stroll through the stranger side of royalty, the most perverted kings in medieval history, and more. Don't worry, we're keeping things soft and sleepy, just gently exploring the odd habits, unusual desires, and secret scandals of kings who ruled with more than just a crown in mind. No shouting or shock here, just calm, curious tales from behind closed castle doors. So lie back, relax, and let these odd little royal stories lull you gently to sleep. Charles the Mad and the Hairless Court of France, as the heavy stone walls of the Hotel St. Paul closed in around the royal household, an odd hush fell over the French court. This wasn't the usual solemnity of diplomacy or mourning. It was something stranger, something shaved clean. Every man, servant, page, and even royal advisor now bore smooth, hairless heads. Beards vanished, brows were scraped bare, and chins gleamed in candlelight. It was not a trend, it was a decree, one of many sudden, baffling commands issued by King Charles VI of France, who, by the early 1390s, had ceased to be simply Charles, and had become known to whispering courtiers as Charles le Fou, Charles the Mad. Charles VI wasn't always considered mad. Born in 1368 to Charles V and Joanna of Bourbon, he ascended to the throne at just 11 years old and was crowned at Reims in 1380. For a time, things looked promising. Known for his handsomeness and charm, Charles was initially guided by capable uncles and later surrounded by clever advisors. France, although scarred by the 100 Years' War and recent famine, was cautiously optimistic about the young monarch. But soon the optimism would be overshadowed by an invisible descent into mental fog and cruelty, descent marked not by sweeping wars or political coups, but by the quiet, strange policies of a king who began to lose grip on reality. One of the most curious symptoms of Charles's affliction was a fixation with cleanliness and order, not in the hygienic sense, but in the symbolic sense. He began to demand things that made no rational sense to anyone but himself. One of these demands involved hair, for reasons never recorded in full. Charles became convinced that hair, especially facial and body hair, carried curses, carried thoughts, or perhaps just carried danger. Within a month, he commanded the entire inner circle of courtmen to remove all visible hair, from the top of the head to the smallest brow. It was said that those who failed to comply were barred from court duties, and sometimes imprisoned in cellars until they consented to the razor. But it wasn't just men, Charles, it was whispered, found comfort only among those who resembled dolls or ghosts, smooth, quiet, sterile. Some of the women at court reportedly used wax to remove their eyebrows completely, a beauty trend that would stick for years in some elite circles, despite the discomfort and rash it caused. There were entire mornings devoted to group grooming, rituals in the Queen's quarters, where women helped each other scrape their faces clean with beeswax, lime paste, or even sharp river stones, careful not to draw blood under the watchful eyes of the king's attendants. Behind this strange ritual, though, was a growing terror. Courtiers lived in quiet fear of Charles's unpredictable moods. Some days, he would wander the palace halls, in silence, dressed head to toe in linen, pausing to stroke the bare cheeks of servants, as if confirming their obedience. Other days, he would erupt into violence at the sight of a patchy beard or a poorly plucked face. The demons hide in the hair, he reportedly mumbled one day to a stable boy, and the hair speaks when I sleep. His paranoia was so deep that he had tapestries burned if they depicted too much hair on saints or kings. Monks with long beards were refused audience. Even statues with carved beards were temporarily covered in black cloth. There were worse days still. In August of 1392, Charles committed one of the most terrifying acts of his reign. While riding through the forest on a military campaign, a sudden episode overtook him. He leaped from his horse and murdered several of his own knights, screaming that they were traitors sent by his brother. When brought back to Paris, his madness grew even more dangerous. One day, he awoke believing he was made of glass and would shatter if touched. He demanded that iron rods be sewn into his clothes to keep him from cracking. Anyone who approached too fast, even his wife Isabeau of Bavaria, was shoved away violently or screamed at until they retreated. This paranoia began to infect policy in strange ways. The court physicians, none of whom could truly understand what they were treating, advised minimal stimulation and a calm, orderly environment. And so, noise was banned in certain corridors of the palace. Bright colors were muted. Pages were instructed to walk in soft slippers. Banquets were held in near silence, and musicians were told to play only in far corners, their harps barely audible over the clinking of goblets. The once vibrant court of France had become a gray, padded cell of politeness and whispered dread. Amid all this, the hairlessness persisted. There is a peculiar kind of perversion in control, and Charles's obsession wasn't with flesh in the erotic sense, it was the psychological domination of forcing others into conformity through appearance. In shaving the people around him, Charles was perhaps shaving away his own fears, removing chaos from a world he no longer recognized as real. Every time a servant bent their neck for the razor, they participated in a strange kind of obedience to a king's might, but to his madness. But as with all royal courts, appearances deceived. Underneath the polished domes of smooth heads and the gloss of artificial calm, a power struggle was bubbling. Charles's episodes had created a vacuum, and his relatives, especially his brother Louis of Orleans and his uncle Philip the Bold, were eager to exploit the situation. While Charles paced his garden in the company of silent, hairless guards, others plotted over land, taxes, and succession. France, though not yet in full collapse, was losing its pulse. Some chroniclers, like Jean Froissart, tried to record the strangeness of it all, but even they seemed confused. Froissart once noted, "The king is in good health, save for the times he forgets who he is." Another described him sitting still for hours, staring at candle flames, occasionally flinching, as if they had spoken. His queen, Isabeau, bore him many children during these years, though some historians now wonder how often Charles was mentally present in his own bedroom. Rumors circulated that she sought comfort elsewhere, especially as her husband became less king and more ghost. The symbolism of hairlessness extended into even more surreal policies. One decree forbade dogs with long fur from entering the royal grounds. Another demanded that all court portraits be redone with minimal emphasis on hair, even if it meant altering the likeness. These strange rules were enforced unevenly, but their message was clear. The king was no longer a man of France, but a dream trapped in silk and silence, watching a world he no longer understood. But was there something deeper to Charles's fixation? Could the removal of hair, the silencing of color and sound, the eerily quiet mealsal of it, have been Charles's way of trying to escape something he couldn't name? Perhaps in shaving the world around him, he was trying to peel back the layers of a world that hurt to look at. And if so, what exactly was it that he was so afraid to see? As Charles VI's illness deepened, the French court no longer merely operated beside his madness, it was consumed by it. Rituals became routine, grooming became governance. The king's mental world, once limited to private fits and odd orders, now seeped into every facet of life at court. Ministers and nobles had to adapt or be exiled. France did not have the luxury of pressing pause on politics, even as its ruler wandered the palace, whispering to his reflection, unable to remember his wife's name or that he was king at all. Behind closed doors, the question of Charles's condition became a battleground of speculation, superstition, and desperation. Some believed he was cursed. Others blamed it on inherited madness from the Bourbon bloodline. His mother, after all, had shown signs of melancholy and reclusion. There were murmurs about poisons, devilish cabals, or divine punishment. But whatever the origin, the symptoms were painfully visible. He often failed to recognize his own children. At times, he forgot he was married. Most famously, he was convinced on multiple occasions that he was made of glass, a belief so powerful that he refused to be touched, feared breaking apart, and ordered special garments to reinforce his limbs. This particular delusion came to define him even after his death. To history, Charles would always be the glass king. The palace, once a vibrant hub of pageantry, grew somber. Walls were padded with tapestries to muffle sound. Candles were chosen carefully, not too bright, not too flickering. Entire wings were kept quiet so as not to trigger his episodes. Those closest to the king had to walk slowly, never raise their voices, and always avoid startling him. Even the Queen, Isabeau of Bavaria, followed a carefully choreographed set of behaviors, sometimes bowing to her own husband like she was a guest in her own home. Still, strange commands continued. Charles's fixation on cleanliness intensified. Court dress became colorless and plain. Guards were made to wear soft gloves and carry no visible weapons. Dogs were banned unless they were white and silent. Mirrors, too, became a problem. On some days, Charles would speak to his own reflection for hours, sometimes gently, sometimes with fear. Other times, he would order mirrors removed from rooms entirely, declaring them portals through which spirits watched him. In certain letters, written on his behalf, we find veiled references to glass people who watch from the corners, though it's unclear if this was poetic language or delusional transcription. Outside the palace walls, France was anything but calm. The 100 Years' War with England still raged in fits and starts, and powerful factions within the French nobility jostled for influence. The most powerful players were the king's brother, Louis of Orleans, and his cousin, John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy. With Charles increasingly absent from governance, they each took the opportunity to expand their power and their greed. France, a kingdom rich in land and poor in leadership, became a chessboard for blood relatives and quiet assassins. Yet inside Charles's glassy world, politics moved differently. Nobles shaved their heads, not to win favor, but to avoid punishment. Orders were followed blindly, lest the king erupt in fury or worse, mistake them for an enemy in a hallucination. Those who tried to reason with Charles often failed to reach him. He might look past them or confuse them with someone long dead. And so, courtiers learned to smile silently, nod along with nonsense, and keep their blades hidden. Isabeau, meanwhile, became a figure of great controversy. Left to govern during her husband's worst periods, she developed a reputation for manipulation and self-preservation. Some accused her of carrying on affairs with nobles, including her brother-in-law, Louis of Orleans. Others believed she sought to position her sons and herself sole powers, cutting Charles out entirely. Her enemies called her immoral, decadent, even dangerous. Yet in truth, she was navigating an impossible situation, a court ruled by a man who sometimes thought he was a lion, a ghost, or nothing at all. By 1393, Charles had become increasingly volatile. One incident, known as the Bal des Ardents, the burning ball, nearly destroyed him and many others. During a masquerade to celebrate a noble wedding, Charles and several companions, dressed as wild men, covering themselves in pitch and feathers. It was meant to be entertainment, the wild men of the woods dancing for the court. But a torch was brought too close, perhaps by accident, perhaps not. The costumes caught fire. 4 men burned alive. Charles survived barely, but his mind seemed to break further afterward. Some said he believed the fire had been divine punishment. Others believed he no longer distinguished dreams from waking life after that night. This moment marked a clear turning point. From then on, Charles's clear days grew rarer. Weeks would pass with no sign of lucidity. He sometimes did not speak. Other times, he spoke only to the air. His letters, when written at all, were dictated through attendants who struggled to piece together meaning. In one surviving fragment, he reportedly dictated, "If the mirror is not fed, the dog will return in the smoke." To a medieval mind, such utterances held terrifying power. Many around him began to suspect demonic possession or divine punishment, and treatments grew more extreme: cold baths, leeches, bloodletting, even exorcisms. Behind these rituals lay fear not only of Charles, but of what France was becoming. The once mighty kingdom now seemed governed by shadows and whispers. Advisors signed documents in the king's name without his knowledge. Armies were raised and disbanded by relatives. Money disappeared into unknown pockets. And all the while, Charles sat silent in his private quarters, combing through his linens, looking for signs of betrayal in the folds of fabric. On one occasion, he was found gently shaking a wooden doll in a bassinet, believing it to be his lost son. One curious element in this period was the rise of what we might now call therapeutic theater. Some servants, noticing that Charles responded to calm rituals and soft voices, began staging false ceremonies for his benefit. They would reenact council meetings, create mock punishments for invisible criminals, or even pretend to read him news that had never happened. The hope was that Charles might participate, calm himself, and feel useful again. While this approach brought some temporary peace, it further blurred the line between performance and power, especially when real decisions began to get made under the guise of fantasy. Even more curiously, there were as rare but documented when Charles would emerge from his mental fog with frightening clarity. On such days, he would hold court, issue decrees, and speak with terrifying insight. He seemed aware of what had happened to him during his episodes, though only vaguely. He often wept. He apologized to his children. He once said to a scribe, "Do not write what I say. The man you see is not the one who speaks. I am somewhere else." These brief windows of lucidity were perhaps the cruelest part of his illness, moments of clarity that reminded everyone, including Charles himself, of what had been lost. The image of a glass king might seem poetic today, but in 15th century France, it was anything but romantic. It was terrifying. A monarch who could not be touched. A leader who feared his own reflection. A father who forgot his children's names. And a court forced to dance around him in silence, scraping hair from their faces, praying he would not shatter before their eyes. But if Charles saw danger in his own face, what did he believe lived behind the mirror? By the early 1400s, the reign of Charles VI had fully transitioned from a monarchy to a masquerade. The king still lived, and on occasion still ruled, but it was a rule in name only. The royal seal might still bear his insignia, but the hands that placed it on parchment were often not his. France, meanwhile, was quietly bleeding, not from battle wounds alone, but from a slow, choking fracture of its very structure. The king's madness had become the permanent air the court breathed, and like a mold in the walls of the palace, it crept into everything. In truth, Charles had long since stopped being a king in the conventional sense. Instead, he was a symbol, sometimes revered, sometimes feared, often pitied. When lucid, he was said to have a gentle temperament, even a melancholic beauty to him. He was polite. He listened. He sometimes made wise observations. But when the veil fell again, always did he, transformed into something else entirely. He could not be trusted to eat properly, to dress himself, or even to recognize the people he had once loved most. At times, he believed he was dead. At others, he claimed he was St. George. And always, the rituals of silence and smoothness had to continue around him. The court itself had fractured into two main factions: the Burgundians, led by John, the fearless Duke of Burgundy, and the Armagnacs, led by supporters of the Duke of Orleans and later his descendants. Each side claimed to act in the king's interest. Each side used Charles's illness as a shield to cover ambition. And each side accused the other of exploiting the king's broken mind for personal gain. Their rivalry would soon explode into open civil war that would tear France apart from within, even as the English pressed on from without. Meanwhile, Charles continued to live inside a surreal routine. He became fixated on certain numbers, requiring his meals to be served on plates arranged in multiples of 4. He refused to eat meals prepared by anyone outside. A small group of servants, whom he recognized sometimes not for weeks at a time. When his own son, the future Charles VII, came to visit him during an episode, the king mistook him for a stranger and had him escorted out of the room. On another occasion, he demanded a priest to come remove the lizard from his pillow. There was no lizard, of course, only the heavy fog of a disintegrating mind. These stories, though tinged with sorrow, also show the unintended cruelty of court life. Those closest to the king were constantly forced to play roles, never certain if today they would be family foe or figment in Charles's eyes. His wife, Isabeau, came to be known as the she-wolf of France by some chroniclers, though that name hardly seems fair. She had borne over a dozen children. She had governed in her husband's absence, signed treaties, secured regencies, and tried, however imperfectly, to maintain some version of stability. The blame heaped on her was often a way for others to excuse their own power grabs. In these years, the obsession with cleanliness evolved into full ceremonial sterilization. The king's chambers were scrubbed with vinegar. He refused to wear the same clothing more than once. Courtiers, it is said, began using perfume, out of luxury, but because Charles believed certain scents warded off evil. A chambermaid once recorded in a margin that the king would only speak to her if she wore the bitter root of angelica tied in her hair, though by then, of course, the court had long since shaved their heads. Hair, it seemed, was never allowed to grow again. Even as younger nobles mocked the tradition in private, no one dared rebel. The symbolic value had grown too large. A man seen with a beard might be labeled disloyal. A child with long locks might be whisked away for purification. In an odd turn of fashion history, this obsession influenced art. Portraits from this time often depicted French nobles with unnaturally smooth faces and scalps, creating a visual record of an invisible tyranny. But for all the fear and isolation, Charles was still not a monster. He was, in many ways, a prisoner locked inside a body and a brain that betrayed him. Letters from attending priests and physicians reveal a haunting picture. A man who prayed constantly, sometimes crying, sometimes laughing, often confused. In one account, he asked if he had been replaced by a better king. In another, he said softly to his nursemaid, "I have dreamed of being well, and I awoke in the same place." He would live like this for decades. The French people, unable to remove him and unwilling to abandon monarchy entirely, simply adjusted. Revolts sparked in the countryside. Taxes rose. Cities fell to foreign invaders. And all the while, the king sat in his velvet chair, sometimes smiling at nothing, sometimes screaming into a mirror, sometimes softly humming songs from his youth that no one else remembered. In 1415, France suffered one of its most humiliating defeats at the Battle of Agincourt. The English, led by King Henry V, decimated the French forces, partly due to superior tactics, but largely due to the disunity among France's own leaders. Charles was not present at the battle. He likely didn't even know it had occurred. But the loss signaled the beginning of a national unraveling. Soon, Henry V would force the Treaty of Troyes, which shockingly disinherited Charles's own son in favor of the English crown. France, it seemed, was no longer French, and Charles. He outlived many of the people who used him. John the Fearless was assassinated. Louis of Orleans was murdered. Isabeau faded into quiet disgrace. Even the English king who had claimed France died young, but Charles VI lingered. In his final years, he was housed mostly in the Hotel St. Paul, cared for by a shrinking circle of attendants. He rarely spoke. His body grew thin. He no longer shaved, no longer needed to, as his hair had stopped growing long before. Perhaps a final mercy. He died in 1422 at the age of 53. His death was quiet. Paris did not erupt in mourning. The people had long since learned to live without him. His son, Charles VII, would eventually reclaim the crown with the help of a peasant girl from Lorraine named Joan, though that story would come later. Today, Charles VI is remembered with mixed feelings. As a failed king, as a madman, as a footnote, but if one listens closely, another truth begins to whisper through the silence of his reign. He was also a man suffering in an age that had no name for his illness. A man whose paranoia became politics, whose fear became fashion, and whose shattered mind, like glass, reflected back not only his own chaos, but the fragile, trembling court that danced around him. And perhaps the most haunting question of all is this: was Charles ever truly mad? Or did his madness simply reveal the madness already rooted in the world around him? Alfonso the Slobberer, the king who loved flesh more than power * in the quiet northern hills of medieval Spain, nestled within the dust-strewn courts of Leon and Galicia, lived a king who ruled not through strength or strategy, but through appetite. Alfonso IX of Leon, who reigned from 1188 to 1230, was a monarch whose legacy was soaked not in conquest, but in carnality. While other rulers planned crusades, signed treaties, or governed with theological rigor, Alfonso was more concerned with the moist warmth of the human body and the indulgent pleasures of the table. He was not called the Slobberer in his own time, no. His courtiers were too afraid or polite. But the moniker came later, whispered by chroniclers who puzzled over his reign. They noted the peculiar way his mouth rarely shut completely, how a thin thread of saliva often glossed his lower lip when he grew excited, usually over roast meat or young women. It was not a nickname of admiration. It was pity and revulsion wrapped together. And yet, Alfonso ruled for over 4 decades. Somehow, in the murk of his hungers, he survived. His story begins with a contradiction. Alfonso was deeply educated. He founded the University of Salamanca, supported early parliamentary institutions, and understood Latin well enough to compose his own prayers. He was also extremely pious on paper, often issuing charters that declared his desire to walk in the path of saints. Yet these declarations rang hollow when compared with his behavior. He was frequently at odds with the church, not theology, but over his inability to resist the company of women who were not his wife. And there were many. Alfonso's lusts were not elegant affairs. They were impulsive, impatient, and sometimes public. Tavern girls, noble daughters, merchant wives, no one was truly off limits. He fathered at least a dozen illegitimate children, possibly more, and occasionally housed his mistresses within the palace walls. This shocked the clergy, who protested loudly, calling his court a nest of indecency. But Alfonso, never one for shame, responded with a simple decree: a king may desire what God has created. It was not theological reasoning, was raw justification. His legitimate marriage, too, was tangled in lust and scandal. In 1191, Alfonso married his cousin, Teresa of Portugal. The union was politically smart. It strengthened ties with neighboring Portugal and offered stability. But there was one problem. It was too close in blood. The church declared it incestuous and void. Alfonso, however, refused to dissolve the marriage for several years, continuing to live with Teresa and fathering multiple children with her. When the Pope finally forced his hand, he relented, but he never stopped loving her, nor did he stop inviting other women to court. The consequences of Alfonso's appetite were not only spiritual, they were political. His relationship with the papacy was strained for much of his reign. He was excommunicated multiple times, and papal legates often traveled to Leon to reprimand or negotiate with him. At one point, he was denied communion until he dismissed his latest mistress. Alfonso complied for about a week. Then, according to one account, he had the woman smuggled back into the castle, disguised as a cook. But it wasn't just women. Alfonso's love of food was just as overwhelming. He was known to hold midnight feasts, sometimes 3 in a single night: boar, suckling, pig, goose, lamale, roasted and heavily salted. He favored rich sauces, soaked bread, and desserts, so sweet they made visiting nobles sick. His kitchen was enormous, employing dozens of bakers and butchers, and his personal physician once begged him to stop consuming cured meats, claiming it was worsening his digestion. Alfonso responded by building a second smokehouse on palace grounds. Despite this gluttony, Alfonso was not obese. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and had a surprisingly agile body, especially in his youth. Chroniclers often described his strength, his booming voice, and his animal warmth, which drew people in despite their better judgment. His charisma was magnetic, and perhaps this, more than anything, is what preserved his reign. People forgave him. They excused the scandals. He gave to the poor. He funded hospitals. He was not cruel, merely indulgent. And indulgence, for a king, was a sin many could accept. Even so, his court was viewed with suspicion. Monasteries warned their novices not to seek favor in Leon. The Archbishop of Santiago once called the royal court a feast for demons. Yet Alfonso remained unapologetic. He joked openly about his sins. He gave mistresses titles and estates. One, a former baker's daughter named Aldonza, was granted a tower and a title after giving birth to his 5th bastard son. When nobles protested, he answered simply, "She feeds me in more ways than one." These behaviors, bizarre as they were, coexisted with moments of true governance. Alfonso convened the Cortes of Leon in 1188, a parliamentary gathering considered by some historians to be among the first of its kind in Europe. He was a defender of municipal rights, a builder of towns, and a supporter of public works. Yet, even in these achievements, his personal appetites often bled into policy. A proposed tax on meat imports was vetoed when Alfonso feared it would affect the price of his favorite pork. A scandal broke out when it was discovered that a public grain store had been converted into a private bakery for the king. There was little separation between Alfonso the ruler and Alfonso the man, and the man was ruled by 2 forces, lust and hunger. As he aged, these hungers changed shape but never disappeared. He grew more discreet, but not more disciplined. His youngest mistress, taken when he was nearly 60, was barely 17. His final banquet, days before his death, reportedly lasted 8 hours and featured 5 whole lambs. And yet, somehow, his people did not revolt. His nobles did not overthrow him. His sons, legitimate and not, continued to serve in his court. Alfonso ruled until the very ends, slobbering, smiling, satisfied. The mystery of his reign lies not in his actions, but in how such behavior managed to coexist with peace, stability, and even affection from many of his subjects. He once declared in court, "Let it not be said that the King of Leon ruled with a dry tongue. Indeed, it never was." But behind the laughter, the roasted meats, and the scandalous moans in the hallways, was there a man trying to escape something deeper? If Alfonso IX ruled by appetite, then his court was the theater in which those appetites were constantly staged and, sometimes hidden, but never for long. The nobles of Leon and Galicia grew used to a strange rhythm in their political lives. One moment they were discussing land grants and cathedral renovations. The next, they found themselves awkwardly seated at royal banquets alongside mistresses in velvet gowns, children of uncertain parentage climbing under the tables, and Alfonso himself laughing with his mouth open wide enough to reveal half-chewed meat. It was an exhausting duality. Real governance, surrounded by the haze of indulgent spectacle. The church remained the primary force resisting Alfonso's more excessive behaviors. From the moment he married his cousin, Teresa of Portugal, the church had its eye on him. Despite numerous papal warnings, Alfonso refused to separate from her until years after the union was declared invalid. Even after their formal separation, he continued to support her politically, and some say he visited her chambers well after she had left court. His relationship with the church was tense, never quite broken, never fully restored. Excommunication was used more than once, though rarely enforced to its full extent. Alfonso had a way of charming papal envoys, often feeding them well and pretending piety until they left. One chronicler recounts a scene in which a cardinal visited Alfonso with a list of grievances, only to leave the castle drunk, laughing, and carrying a rare jug of Leonese wine gifted by the king. The king may be sinful, the envoy wrote later, but he sins with generosity. Despite their frustrations, church officials couldn't ignore Alfonso's contributions to religious life. He funded the construction of monasteries and ensured the repair of key cathedrals damaged during previous wars. His personal piety, sincere, despite everything seemed to conflict with his behaviors. He prayed daily, carried relics on his person, and even made generous donations during Lent. He confessed regularly, though never repented in action. It was as if he believed his indulgences were permitted, so long as they were balanced by good deeds. In truth, this was a common medieval belief, though Alfonso pushed it to absurd extremes. Inside the palace, the balance between public and private collapsed entirely. Alfonso refused to create a formal distinction between his official advisors and his lovers. Some mistresses were given seats at court meetings, not because they had political knowledge, but because Alfonso liked having them nearby. At least 2 women, known only by their first names, Selvira and Mirio, were said to have sat in on military councils, offering no opinions, simply feeding the king pieces of fruit as he spoke. This casual mix of intimacy and governance frustrated his nobles, many of them, bound by tradition and wary of papal disapproval, found themselves in the awkward position of tolerating scandal to preserve influence. One noble, the Count of Lugo, once attempted to confront the king about a mistress who had insulted his wife. Alfonso responded by laughing and offering the count a gift of salted ham and a new tunic. The insult was never mentioned again, but Alfonso's relationships with his many children, legitimate and otherwise, reveal more about his character than any banquet. He never hid his bastards. In fact, he gave most of them titles, land, or military posts. Some were even better educated than their legitimate siblings. His court became a strange kind of blended family. Royal half-brothers competing for influence, daughters from different mothers marrying into rival houses, and always the king at the center, distributing favors based on mood rather than law. One of his most famous illegitimate sons, Ferdinand of Castile, went on to play a key role in Iberian politics. He was well liked by the nobility, sharp-minded, and unafraid to call out his father's inconsistencies. Alfonso admired this. "He has my fire," he once said, "but not my thirst." Others were less disciplined, indulging in the same excesses their father modeled. Scandals broke out frequently among Alfonso's offspring. Affairs, duels, drunken outbursts. It was a palace of pleasure, but also of instability. Still, for all his moral unpredictability, Alfonso was rarely cruel. He had no reputation for torture or execution. He forgave insults quickly. When one of his sons accidentally insulted visiting French bishop during a feast, allegedly by asking whether Frenchmen enjoyed licking the Pope's boot or just sniffing it, Alfonso only laughed and gave the boy more wine. "The lad speaks plainly," he said. "It must be the Castilian in him." It was this same unflappable humor that allowed Alfonso to hold his throne for so long. Even when nobles plotted against him, they did so with hesitation. The man had survived papal threats, domestic unrest, and even an illness that left him bedridden for months in 1211, when the court feared he might die. Alfonso reportedly called for all his children legitimate and not to stand before him. Then he gave each a roasted chestnut and told them to remember how sweet life could be even when burnt. But beneath the warmth, cracks were showing. Alfonso's overindulgence in food had finally caught up with him. His teeth were rotting, and his stomach troubled him constantly. Physicians warned him of spasms of the gut and prescribed a bland diet. He ignored them. Instead, he held late-night roasts in his chambers, often alone, gnawing on meat until sunrise. His appetite had become his comfort, but also his punishment. He was bloating. He was aging, and his court knew it. Yet even as his body began to betray him, Alfonso's mind remained sharp. He negotiated trade deals, resolved border disputes, and planned a final expansion of his university system. He composed verses in Latin, now lost, which some scholars believe were meditations on death and indulgence. According to one record, he wrote a line that read, "I am a man who kissed too often, but still I am king." It is unclear whether he meant it as regret or pride. By the final years of his life, Alfonso rarely left the palace. He was seen less in public and more often behind thick curtains, attended by loyal servants and one final mistressa, widow named Inez, who reportedly read to him from scripture as he ate candied plums. His court grew quieter. The scandals faded, the laughter less frequent. He had not changed. The world simply grew tired. But what kept him going, even as his health declined? Was it love, lust, or the simple pleasure of routine roast goose, a soft pillow, and a warm body beside him? Or did he fear what came next, when no feast could distract, and no woman could shield him from the judgment of a church he had toyed with for so long? By the time Alfonso IX reached the final year of his reign in 1230, the once vigorous monarch had become a figure of contradiction. King known as much for his devotion to education and law as for his obsession with flesh and flavor, he was aging rapidly. The thick chestnut beard that once framed his broad face had turned nearly white. His once loud voice, which could fill banquet halls and battlegrounds alike, was now a coarse whisper. His hands, once strong enough to break bread without a knife, now trembled with a faint palsy. And yet the apatith, his defining companion, remained. He spent much of his last year in the royal palace of Leon, rarely venturing out. When he did appear, he wore thick woolen robes lined with fur, not out of vanity, but to hide the weight, loss, and frailty that had begun to consume him. His physicians, desperate to slow the deterioration, prescribed broths and herbs, but Alfonso demanded meat. His meals became rituals of memory, reminders of vitality. He insisted on being served roasted pigeon, lamb, kidneys in garlic, and heavily spiced sausages, dishes that had once defined his court. Sometimes he could only nibble, sometimes he vomited them back up. Still, he asked for more, though his body betrayed him. Alfonso's mind sharpened oddly in those final months. Perhaps he sensed the end, or perhaps the burdens of governance law, dulled by sensual distractions, finally demanded clarity. He summoned scholars and scribes and dictated reforms to inheritance laws, clarified municipal rights, and ordered a reorganization of the university he had founded decades earlier. These efforts, largely ignored by history, suggest a king not entirely lost to gluttony, but one who had always believed governance and pleasure could coexist. He also summoned his children, legitimate and illegitimate. They were called to court, not in ceremony, but in intimacy. They arrived in staggered groups, uncertain of their welcome. The royal palace, once loud with laughter and scandal, now echoed with hushed greetings and awkward family reunions. Some had not seen one another in years. Tensions lingered, sentiments over favoritism, inheritance, the identities of mothers, and the validity of claims. Yet Alfonso received them all with warmth. He kissed their cheeks, asked about their travels, and spoke of the past as though it were a long, exaggerated joke. There was a time, he told one daughter, when I ate 12 figs a night and still made love before sunrise. I was a fool, but I was a happy one. He gave each child a gift, a personal item, a signed document, a land grant, or in one case, an old bottle of wine from his youth. He didn't speak of death, but it lingered behind every sentence. There was no formal declaration of succession. Instead, Alfonso left his kingdom in a muddled legal state. His legitimate son, Ferdinand, whose mother was Teresa of Portugal, was clearly the preferred heir, but factions remained. Alfonso left it to them to resolve. Perhaps he believed that legacy mattered less than indulgence. Or perhaps he simply couldn't bear to pick one child above the others. One of the final records of his life comes not from a priest or noble, but from a servant-woman who cleaned his chamber pot. She later told a monk that in the final week of his life, Alfonso refused to be moved from his chair. He sat in front of a small fire, swaddled in blankets, eating bits of sweet bread and muttering to himself. At night, he asked that the window be left open so he could smell the cold air. "Let the wind come in," he reportedly said, "and taste the world I am leaving." His final night was quiet. A single candle burned. His last known visitor was Ines, the widow who had read to him from the Bible in his declining days. She held his hand, wept softly, and recited a passage from the Psalms. Alfonso reportedly interrupted her, chuckled weakly, and said, "Even David had too many wives." Then, with a sigh that turned into a wheeze, he fell asleep. He did not wake again. Alfonso IX died in September of 1230. His funeral, unlike his life, was plain. The clergy who had long opposed him buried him in the Cathedral of Santiago de Compostela, beside his son Sancho. The ceremony was brief, the eulogies cautious. His body was dressed in simple linen, but it said that tucked into his coffin, alongside his sword and a cross, was a small pouch of dried figs. In the years after his death, Alfonso's memory split in two. To the church and many chroniclers, he was remembered as an unrepentant, Cinnaran excommunicated monarch who defied moral law. To the people of Leon and Galicia, he was remembered more fondly as a king who, despite his personal failings, gave generously, ruled fairly, and loved life too much to ever hide it. His descendants, both legitimate and not, spread across the Iberian Peninsula, many serving in noble roles, some entering monasteries, perhaps hoping to atone for the fleshly excesses of their father. What can we make of a man like Alfonso? Was he merely a lustful glutton, a medieval hedonist who happened to wear a crown? Or was he something more complex, a man who believed the pleasures of the world were not in conflict with duty, but a part of it? His life forces us to consider whether kingship must always be sober, whether indulgence corrupts power, or whether sometimes a ruler can be beloved even while his mouth is full and his belt strained. Alfonso IX reminds us that history is not made only by the noble and the austere. Sometimes it is shaped by the undisciplined, the fleshly, the men who, despite their slobber and scandal, leave behind universities, laws, and children who still remember their laughter. And perhaps, in the final account of kings, that too is worth remembering. Charles the Mad, the king who thought he was glass asterisk, long before the halls of Versailles echoed with powdered wigs and revolution, there stood another monarch of France whose reign was defined not by glory or governance, but by madness. His name was Charles VI, but to many he became known as Charles the Mad. His story, laced with delusions, erratic violence, and the fragile terror of believing oneself made of glass, reveals a world in which the mind of a monarch could crack, like a mirror, sending splinters through an entire kingdom. Charles VI was born in 1368 into the House of Valois, a royal family already strained by war, politics, and inheritance disputes. He was made king at the tender age of 11, following the death of his father. Charles V, at first, he ruled under a regency headed by his uncles, powerful men who preferred to enrich themselves at court rather than steward the young kings. These early years were filled with banquets, taxes, and a draining war with England. But for Charles himself, there were whispers from the beginning that something was not quite right as a boy. Charles was described as bright and physically robust, with an imposing presence and an occasional tendency to drift off mid-conversation. His tutors noted moments of strange detachment, days when he would not speak, or speak only in short, whispered phrases, as though listening for sounds no one else could hear. Physicians at the time dismissed these episodes as melancholia, a common diagnosis for moods that defied understanding. But others, especially those closest to him, sensed something deeper stirring within. When Charles came of age, and took the reins of power in the early 1380s. Many hoped that the boy king would become a unifying figure. He was handsome, charismatic, and eager to prove himself. He wore fine clothing, loved elaborate jousts, and tried to revive the courtly manners of old. At first, it seemed he might succeed. He removed his greedy uncles from government and empowered trusted advisors instead. But then came the first break. It was the summer of 1392, during a military campaign against a rebellious noble. The journey to Brittany was long and hot, and the king, already stressed, was said to be irritable and sleep-deprived. While traveling through the forest near Le Mans, a barefoot man leaped from the trees and shouted at the king's retinue, declaring that Charles had been betrayed. Though the man was quickly seized, something in his words seemed to lodge in the king's brain. Hours later, Charles fell into a fit of rage. One of his knights accidentally dropped a lance, and the sudden clatter startled the king. In a blinding moment, Charles drew his sword and attacked his own men, shouting incoherently. He killed at least one knight and wounded several others before collapsing from exhaustion. He was dragged off the field and taken to safety, but when he awoke, he could not remember the incident. This was the first public sign of his mental unraveling, but it would not be the last. Over the following years, Charles would suffer from more episodes, some violent, some simply bizarre. He would walk the palace halls without recognition of his wife or children. He insisted that his name was not Charles. At times, he refused to bathe, believing water would poison him. At other times, he stripped naked and ran screaming through the gardens, convinced he was being hunted by invisible foes. And then came the glass delusion. Sometime in the late 1390s, Charles began to suffer from what modern historians now call the glass delusionous psychological disorder, in which individuals believe their bodies are made of fragile glass. It was not unknown in the late medieval period, particularly among the educated or noble class, but Charles' case became the most infamous. He would sit motionless for hours, terrified that a single movement might cause him to shatter. He reportedly wore iron rods sewn into his clothing to reinforce his limbs and prevent accidents. He forbade anyone from touching him without permission, and sometimes screamed in terror when approached too quickly at court. This madness had a paralyzing effect. Courtiers were instructed to speak softly, avoid sudden gestures, and never bring glassware near the king's chambers. Physicians offered treatments ranging from cold compresses to prayers, none of which helped. Priests blamed demons. Scholars blamed humors. Meanwhile, the king's council governed in his name, though their loyalties often wavered with his condition. France, already weakened by the 100 Years' War, began to splinter. Charles' wife, Queen Isabeau of Bavaria, was forced into a precarious role, part caretaker, part political actor. His brother, Louis of Orleans, vied for power, while John, the fearless Duke of Burgundy, maneuvered to counter him. The court became a battlefield of factions, each exploiting the king's absence of mind for its own gain. Yet, through it all, Charles remained, sometimes lucid, sometimes entirely lost, a man trapped within the glass palace of his own mind. Those who visited him in his clearer moments described a sad, reflective man who understood that he was broken but could do nothing to stop the breaking. He wept often. He asked about his children. He apologized for the things he could not remember, and still, The kingdom waited for a cure that would not come, for a decision that could not be made, for a king who was there and yet not there at all. What does it mean for a kingdom to be ruled by a man who believes he might shatter at any moment? Could a realm survive when the crown sat upon a head filled with ghosts, phantoms, and fear? Or was France already beginning to fracture, not because of war, but because its king had forgotten how to be solid? By the turn of the 15th century, the French court had grown accustomed to the rhythms of madness. When Charles VI was lucid, he ruled often with unexpected clarity and softness, issuing decrees, attending mass, and speaking kindly with courtiers. But these episodes were unpredictable, like rain in a desert. Most of the time, France was governed in his name by others, his wife, his uncles, and most divisively, the feuding factions of Orleans and Burgundy. Each power struggle began with the same quiet lie that it was only temporary, that the king would recover, that his next bout of lucidity was just around the corner. But Charles' illness was not temporary. His episodes of delusion became more frequent and longer in duration. Sometimes he disappeared into total silence for days. Other times he raved through the night, calling himself St. George, or insisting he was made of snow, not glass. The royal physicians could offer no remedy beyond isolation and restraint. His courtiers became experts in patience and performance. They would bow deeply to a man who sometimes thought he was not the king at all. They would weep when he failed to recognize his own son, the future Charles VII. Meals were served slowly, so as not to startle him. Documents were read to him twice, in case he forgot the first reading. No sudden movements, no sharp objects. Always walk softly, as if the very floor might crack. The madness also had a ceremonial routine. Whenever Charles descended into another delusion, a velvet curtain was drawn around the royal seat. Behind it, ministers met, wars were plotted, marriages arranged, all with the fiction that the king still ruled. Sometimes he was wheeled in, silent and pale, to preside over council sessions he could not follow. No one dared question the illusion. The dignity of the monarchy depended on it. Outside the palace walls, however, the cracks in the kingdom widened. The countryside was restless. Taxes were raised to fund the never-ending war with England. Famine lingered. Brigands roamed freely across the roads of northern France. Peasants whispered that the king's madness was a curse, a punishment from God for forgotten sins. Others claimed it was sorcery, that Queen Isabeau had bewitched him to seize power for her German relatives. The truth was simpler and sadder. Charles had simply inherited a broken mind. Historians now suspect schizophrenia or severe bipolar disorder. His maternal grandmother, Margaret of Bavaria, was known for strange behaviors, and his son, Charles VII, would later show signs of anxiety and paranoia. But medieval medicine had no language for these conditions. They offered leeches, incense, and Latin prayers. The real tragedy, though, lay in how the king's mind became a tool for others. His brother Louis, Duke of Orleans, saw opportunity in the king's absence. Ambitious and charming, Louis became de facto regent, guiding policy, collecting titles, and cultivating a lavish court. He surrounded himself with poets, artists, and astrologers. He also accumulated enemies, none more dangerous than John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy. Burgundy and Orleans were cousins by blood, but rivals in everything else. Their feud born in courtly whisperings, soon became a war of pamphlets, slander, and secret alliances. At the center of it all sat Charles VI, fragile and absent, with his signature forged on half the documents of state. In 1407, the tension snapped. One cold November night, Louis of Orleans was ambushed on the streets of Paris and murdered by men loyal to Burgundy. His skull was crushed, his body left broken in the mud. John the Fearless admitted to ordering the killing, claiming it was to protect the kingdom from evil counsel. Civil war followed, dragging France into a deeper chasm. All the while, Charles remained a pale figure at the center. When told of his brother's death, he reportedly wept silently for hours, then asked why the court was so quiet. Days later, he forgot it had happened. His madness had become a shield from grief, from guilt, from the knowledge that his kingdom was slipping away. One of the most bizarre and symbolic episodes of Charles' madness occurred at a court masque in 1393, known to history as the Bal des Ardents, the Ball of the Burning Men. At this masquerade, Charles and several courtiers, dressed as wild men, donning flammable costumes coated in pitch and feathers, a torch, brought too close, ignited the group. 4 of the dancers burned alive. Charles survived, protected by a quick-thinking noblewoman who smothered his costume with her skirts. Though the king's madness was not blamed directly, the image of him dancing in flames wild, laughing, and nearly destroyed by the fire came to symbolize his entire reign. Even in his clearer moments, Charles was aware of how others saw him. He once asked a physician if people feared him. The doctor hesitated. "Not you." Charles nodded. "That is worse," he replied. As the years dragged on, the king began to resemble a ghost. In his own castle, his once louche auburn hair turned gray and patchy. His eyes, once bright with mischief, became distant and cloudy. He wandered the corridors barefoot, muttering to himself. Occasionally, he asked to see his children, but when they came, he often mistook them for strangers. In 1415, the disastrous Battle of Agincourt devastated the French nobility. English archers slaughtered the flower of Valois chivalry. Among the dead were many who had once protected Charles' name and defended his kingdom during his illness. France was now exposed. Its monarch could not speak in complete sentences, and its armies were in retreat and still. The king sat, fragile and quiet, believing he might shatter if someone touched him. How long can a nation survive when its ruler forgets the names of its cities, the shape of its crown, or the purpose of a sword? What happens when a man believes he is made of glass, and the world begins to believe it too? By the final decade of Charles VI's life, the glassy fragility that had haunted his reign hardened into something more permanent. The King of France, once a youth of promise and charm, had grown into a living symbol of royal helplessness. At court, his presence was still treated with ceremonial respect, his robes laid out, his meals served with silver, his throne dusted and polished, but the man who sat upon it was often silent, unseeing, or whispering to himself about invisible injuries and crumbling skin. His mind, long since surrendered to delusions, now seemed to forget even that it was broken. There were no more violent outbursts or dances of flame, only long days where Charles sat alone, surrounded by servants who walked on tiptoe and scribes who wrote decrees he would never read. The kingdom, however, did not wait in stillness. It convulsed. France became a kingdom of factions. After the murder of Louis of Orleans and the rise of John the Fearless, the nation plunged into civil war. The Burgundians, led by John, and the Armagnacs, loyal to the House of Orleans, turned the streets of Paris into rivers of blood. Armored men with painted standards fought in alleys and marketplaces. Entire villages were sacked in the name of restoring order that no longer had a voice. In the middle of this chaos stood Charles, moved, untouched, and often unaware. His wife, Isabeau of Bavaria, effectively took control of court matters, a position that drew scorn from nobles who despised the idea of a foreign-born queen wielding power. She arranged alliances, protected her children, and tried often futilely to negotiate peace between rival factions. Yet her greatest act of preservation was her son, the Dauphin, Charles. She shielded him from the worst of court intrigues, preparing him quietly to inherit a throne that had become a burden. But that inheritance was far from secure. In 1419, John the Fearless was murdered on a bridge at Montereau, stabbed in broad daylight during a parley. His death escalated the civil war to new heights. The Burgundians, furious, turned to the English for aid. In 1420, in one of the most shocking moments of French royal history, Charles VI, though likely unaware of what he was signing, approved the Treaty of Troyes. This treaty disinherited his own son, the Dauphin Charles, and recognized Henry V of England as heir to the French throne. France, in essence, had been handed to its enemy. Charles' madness had now become a legal instrument used by others to reshape the future of the realm. Some historians argue the treaty was signed while Charles was lucid, under pressure from Queen Isabeau and the Burgundians. Others believe he never understood what he was doing. What is certain is that the act shattered the unity of France. From this moment, France became a divided kingdom. The north, including Paris, fell under English control. The south remained loyal to the Dauphin, who now claimed the throne as Charles VII. The 100 Years' War entered its final, most bitter phase, and Charles. He remained in the Louvre, now a prison of silk and marble. Visitors to the court in these years recorded heartbreaking scenes. One described the king sitting by a fire, whispering names from his childhood. Another found him hunched over a bowl of wine, convinced it contained snakes. He no longer recognized his wife. He forgot his children, even the ones who visited daily. Sometimes he would ask where his brother Louis was, forgetting he had been dead for years. His final years were spent like this, withdrawn, sometimes humming, songs from youth, often silent for days at a time. The court rarely mentioned his condition publicly. Official proclamations continued to refer to his beloved presence, but it was a presence more ghost than king. When he died on October 21, 1422, Charles VI had been king for 42 years. Of those, perhaps half were spent in coherent rulership. The rest were a slow, painful unraveling, a descent into madness that left a permanent scar on the French monarchy. His son Charles, long denied and disinherited, was crowned Charles VII in the rival court of Bourges. But it would take a miracle to reclaim the crown of France. That miracle, as history would tell, came not from a noble or a knight, but from a teenage peasant girl, Joan of Arc, in time. Charles VI came to symbolize the dangers of hereditary rule. terrifying prospect that a kingdom might be ruled not by wisdom or even tyranny, but by confusion and shadows. His reign became a warning whispered through the corridors of future palaces. What happens when the body of a king remains, but the mind disappears? And yet, there is something strangely human about Charles VI's tragedy. He was not cruel. He did not crave power. He was, in his rare lucid moments, kind. He wept. He apologized. He remembered, briefly, the names of his children. He asked if it would rain. He believed himself to be made of glass, not because he was weak, but because something inside him had convinced him that to be human was to be fragile. In that, perhaps, he was not so mad after all. Alfonso the Slobberer, the king who couldn't keep his mouth closed, asterisk. In the long list of medieval monarchs whose legacies were etched in iron and blood, few leave behind a trail as damp and awkward as Alfonso IX of Leon. Ruling from 1188 to 1230 in what is now northwestern Spain, Alfonso's reign was long, influential, entangled in wars of succession and religious crusades. Yet he is remembered by many, not for his laws, his battles, or his court intrigues, but for an unfortunate and rather embarrassing nickname, El Baboso. The translation is simple and not entirely flattering. Alfonso was known to contemporaries and chroniclers as the Slobberer, allegedly because he drooled excessively, whether due to a medical condition, a speech impediment, or perhaps a chronic dental disorder. The effect was hard to ignore. At court, ambassadors took notes, priests muttered, pages stifled laughter. It was said that no scroll placed too near him remained dry. But Alfonso's life was far from comedic. He was born into a storm of dynastic division. His father, Ferdinand II of Leon, ruled over a chunk of Iberia, still embattled by the remnants of Islamic rule from the south and fractious rivalries with neighboring Christian kingdoms. Alfonso, born in 1171, was raised with the sword in one hand and a family tree filled with broken branches in the other. His early life was spent largely under the shadow of his father, who struggled to maintain authority across a landscape dotted with rebellious counts and ambitious bishops. When Ferdinand died in 1188, Alfonso inherited the throne of Leon at just 17. It was an age considered barely manhood in some courts. Yet Alfonso quickly made an impression, not just because of his physical quirks, but for his surprising vigor. In leadership, the first act of his reign set him apart from most monarchs of the age. He called the Cortes of Leon, widely considered the first parliament in Europe that included commoners. This was not a symbolic gesture. He gave voice to townspeople, for a king remembered by nickname for a mouth that failed him. He gave others a voice with theirs. But Alfonso's reign wasn't all parliaments and parchment. He was, at his core, a warrior, king riding at the head of armies into the dusty plains and rocky hills that separated Leon from the rest of Iberia. His enemies were both Christian and Muslim. His allies shifted with the wind. His most persistent adversary, however, was family, namely Alfonso VIII of Castile, his cousin. Castile and Leon had long been uneasy neighbors, each vying for dominance in the fragmented Christian north. Though their armies occasionally allied against Muslim forces in the south, their rulers squabbled like siblings sometimes, trading insults, sometimes prisoners, sometimes towns. At one point, Alfonso IX married Teresa of Portugal, a strategic union that produced several children and temporarily calmed tensions. But when the Pope declared the marriage incestuous, an account of distant but canonical consanguinity, Alfonso was forced to annul it. The marriage ended, but his devotion to Teresa remained. He continued to consult with her and kept their children close to the royal court, ignoring papal demands to exile them. Alfonso's disregard for church rules was not limited to his love life. He often appointed bishops without papal approval, resisted crusade tithes, and once told an envoy from Rome that if he wanted Leon's gold, he could come and take it himself. The envoy declined. Still, the king wasn't exactly heretical. He participated in numerous campaigns against the Almohads, the North African Muslim Sline dynasty that controlled parts of southern Spain. He fought alongside other Christian kingdoms. At times, notably in the Battle of Las Navas de Tolosa in 1212, a turning point in the Reconquista. But these alliances were uneasy. Alfonso didn't like taking orders from Castile or Aragon, and he preferred to wage his wars on his own terms. His personal habits were the subject of frequent court gossip. Chroniclers described him as energetic, honest, but afflicted by certain unsightly behaviors. The drooling, especially, was remarked upon not just for its frequency, but for its persistence in public rituals. During Mass, for instance, his attendants reportedly kept cloths nearby to dab his chin. At state dinners, guests were seated carefully to avoid the moist zone of his speaking arc. Yet even this strange detail helped shape a reputation of sorts. Unlike many kings who cloaked themselves in distance and mystique, Alfonso was present sometimes, uncomfortably so. He looked people in the eye. He listened. He didn't hide his body or his flaws. In an age when monarchs were painted as near divine, he was stubbornly mortal. In legal matters, Alfonso was notably advanced. He strengthened the legal independence of towns, promoted the rights of Jewish and Muslim communities under Christian rule, and reinforced the idea of rule by consent. His reputation as a lawgiver remained long after his death, even if the law books he signed had faint smudges along the edges. But not all was peaceful in his later reign. As he aged, Alfonso became increasingly obsessed with succession. His eldest son, Ferdinand, born of his union with Teresa of Portugal, was barred from succession due to the annulled marriage. His other children faced similar legitimacy issues, and the Pope intervened again, insisting that Alfonso recognize a different heir. It was a cruel twist after decades of war, diplomacy, and reform. The king who gave so much to his kingdom would have to cede its future to someone he had not chosen. And all the while, the rumors remained. "He speaks well," one noble reportedly said, "but his mouth betrays him." Another, more cutting, observed, "A king who drools upon the law is still better than one who drowns it in blood." Did Alfonso care? Perhaps. But if he did, he rarely led on. He spent his final years building monasteries, overseeing laws, and writing letters to old friends and enemies alike. The war with Castile flared again. The papacy kept sending letters, and the king kept signing them with a hand steady, a mind sharp, and a chin that never quite stayed dry. Was Alfonso IX remembered more for his mouth than his mind? Possibly, but in an age of brutal kings and silent tyrants, perhaps the drooling man who listened on, acted, was the most human of them all. By the early 1200s, Alfonso X of Leon had ruled for more than 2 decades, no small feat in a century, where monarchs regularly met their ends on the battlefield or through a poisoned chalice. Despite his nickname and papal condemnation, he had earned the loyalty of much of his kingdom, not through spectacle or cruelty, but by simply being present and pragmatic. But time and the tangled knots of royal succession would test him in ways even war had not. Alfonso had sired many children, some legitimate by fleeting ecclesiastical standards, others not. His first marriage, to Teresa of Portugal, had been fruitful in every way but legal. Their union produced 3 children, including Ferdinand, who was, by all accounts, the king's favored heir. But after the Pope annulled the marriage on the grounds of consanguinity, the Church ruled that Ferdinand was illegitimate and thus unfit for the throne. This placed Alfonso in a terrible bind. The boy had grown into a capable young man, educated at court and seasoned by his father's campaigns. To disinherit him based on Rome's decree would mean casting aside a natural heir, while embracing one of his younger, less prepared offspring would risk civil war after his death. Alfonso attempted to navigate this by keeping Ferdinand close, involving him in governance, but without declaring him formally as his successor. An uneasy dance between fatherly trust and political ambiguity. Meanwhile, Isabella of Castile, Alfonso's second wife, whom he also married without proper dispensation, was herself a Castilian princess and the sister of King Henry I of Castile. Their union had been short-lived, again declared invalid by the Pope, but not before producing more children and an avalanche of legal headaches. Alfonso's refusal to bow to papal rulings had left his family tree littered with claims, counterclaims, and accusations of heresy. While the king handled the church with a mix of stubborn defiance and cautious politeness, his nobles were less patient. Many worried about a succession crisis, while others sought to use it to their advantage. A few whispered that Alfonso's unpredictable marriage record and affection for bastards was a sign of divine punishment. Some even went so far as to question his mind, not because he was mad, but because they mistook his simplicity for softness. The drool became a symbol of doubt, a stain used to argue against his judgment. But Alfonso was not blind to the situation. In one of the most unusual political gambits of the era, he began negotiating directly with his former wife, Teresa of Portugal, and her powerful relatives to secure some form of recognition for their son Ferdinand. It was an act of love, strategy, and desperation at the same time. Alfonso also turned to the church not to plead, but to pressure. He donated land, expanded monasteries, and filled bishoprics with men who owed their loyalty to Leon, not Rome. These weren't bribes in the traditional sense, but carefully placed pieces on a chessboard. He hoped that with enough favors and friendly bishops, the idea of Ferdinand as successor would become too politically convenient for the church to oppose. He also sought alliances beyond the church. Alfonso had long maintained a cautious relationship with Muslim rulers to the south. Even while participating in the Reconquista, he occasionally signed truces or allowed Muslim merchants to pass freely through Leon's towns. This tolerance extended to the Jewish community as well. Alfonso's court employed Jewish administrators, scholars, and physicians of practice that earned him both praise and ire. For some, it showed a modern even enlightened view of governance. For others, it confirmed that Alfonso cared more for policy than purity. But policy could only go so far. The looming question remained: who would inherit Leon? In 1212, as Christian forces from across Iberia prepared for the Battle of Las Novas de Tolosa, Alfonso again found himself playing a difficult role. Though he supported the effort to drive the Almohads back into North Africa, he refused to fully submit to the authority of Castile, whose king saw himself as commander of the united Christian armies. Alfonso sent troops, yes, but held back his full strength and avoided placing them directly under Castilian banners. The battle was a victory for Christendom, but it also hardened divisions among the Christian kings. Alfonso returned to Leon, proud but increasingly isolated. In the following years, he began pushing harder for recognition of Ferdinand. He summoned his nobles, issued new legal codes, and quietly began preparing lands and titles to secure his son's future. But the papal resistance never waned. Letters from Rome arrived regularly, warning him against disobedience and urging him to recognize a different successor. These letters were read aloud in court. Alfonso reportedly responded with a snort and a mutter, his words slurred through thick saliva. The Pope names heirs in Rome. In Leon, the crown still follows blood. His voice may have been wet, but his resolve was dry and firm. As he aged, Alfonso's once bright court began to dim. His former wife, Teresa, retreated into religious life. His allies died or drifted away. Even his own children began to squabble, each hoping to position themselves for favor. One final twist came in the late 1220s, when Alfonso's estranged ex-wife, Isabella of Castile, pushed her son, Ferdinand of Castile, later known as Ferdinand III, as a potential unifier of Leon and Castile. This idea horrified Alfonso at first. He had spent his life resisting Castile's dominance. But as death neared, and as his own preferred heir remained unacceptable to Rome, Alfonso began to reconsider. He opened secret negotiations. If he could not have Ferdinand of Portugal, perhaps Ferdinand of Castile, his son by Isabella, could inherit. This Ferdinand was already heir to Castile. If he inherited Leon as well, the two kingdoms would finally reunite, terms that Alfonso could shape in his final breath. It was a strange, bittersweet compromise. The king who had spent decades resisting Rome, resisting Castile, and resisting surrender, was now planning to hand his legacy to both. He made the arrangements quietly. No grand proclamations, no drama, just scribes, messengers, and a signature sealed with the royal ring placed carefully by a hand that trembled not from age, but from uncertainty. As Alfonso looked out over the towers of Leon in his final months, it said he often sat in silence, listening to the bells, speaking to no one. Those who saw him said his chin still glistened, the drool catching sunlight like a sad kind of crown. And yet, even then, he was thinking, plotting, trying to tie the final threads of a kingdom that had never truly held together. By the time Alfonso IX of Leon reached the final year of his life in 1230, the world around him had changed, and so had he. The once fiery and energetic young king, mocked for his drooling and mocked again for his rebellious politics, had become something more complicated, a monarch deeply entangled in the future of Iberia. He was not simply ruling anymore. He was choosing how his kingdom would live on without him, and who would carry the crown he'd fought so hard to steady. His health had begun to deteriorate slowly at first, then sharply. Some records note that he suffered from swelling in the limbs and breath that came with rattling. He likely had dropsy, a condition related to congestive heart failure. But in medieval terms, it was considered simply a sign that the body was preparing to let go. Alfonso had outlived his rivals, outmaneuvered the Pope mostly, and outlasted multiple marriage scandals. But even the most stubborn king cannot outlast time. He withdrew from the bustle of court life and retreated to the monastery of Saria, a quiet, stone-gray sanctuary, surrounded by forest paths and candlelit chapels. It was a fitting place for a king who had always been too earthy for the polished halls of Castile or the golden thrones of Rome. He was surrounded by monks, a few loyal nobles, and not a single bishop from the papal camp. From this silent retreat, he issued one final command, a legal document officially naming Ferdinand III of Castile, his son by Isabella of Castile, as his heir to the kingdom of Leon. In that one stroke of ink, Alfonso ensured the reunification of Leon and Castile, two great Christian realms that had been rivals for generations. But the irony was hard to miss. Alfonso had spent much of his reign resisting such a union, only to secure it himself as his final act. The compromise worked. Ferdinand III became king of both kingdoms, ruling a unified realm that would form the foundation of modern Spain. He was praised as a great conqueror, a religious reformer, and most importantly, a man who did not drool. Alfonso's death in September of 1230 passed quietly. There was no great funeral procession. His burial at Saria Monastery was humble. Even the eulogies were restrained. Some said that was his wish. Others whispered that the church, still fuming over years of disobedience, refused to honor him properly. But for all its lack of pageantry, his burial had something few kings ever achieved, peace, and yet his legacy remained curiously smeared. In later chronicles, Alfonso is often overshadowed by his son, Ferdinand III, who would go on to be canonized as a saint. But Alfonso's role in shaping that legacy is undeniable. He laid the groundwork for the new Iberian unity. He kept civil war at bay. He strengthened towns, empowered commoners, and gave voice to those who had none. His Cortes of Leon, the first parliament in Europe to include commoners, was not a fluke. It was a window into a different kind of monarchy. And still, what did people remember? The mouth, El Baboso, the slobber-er. His contemporaries clung to that name as if it explained everything. In an age obsessed with dignity and divine order, a king who could not control his own drool was considered a walking embarrassment. But maybe that was the point. Alfonso never tried to hide it, never wore a veil, never had his portraits adjusted. His visible imperfection became a form of resistance against the pomp, the hypocrisy, and the unbearable silence of perfect kingship. He governed in spite of it, or perhaps because of it. Centuries later, historians trying to make sense of his reign would write conflicting assessments. Some saw him as weak and soft, more concerned with laws than with conquest. Others argued that his softness was his strength, that his humility, his tolerance, and even his awkward humanity were precisely what made him a great ruler. He wasn't trying to be a saint. He was trying to be a decent king. A chronicler from the 14th century wrote, "He was not fierce like the lions of Leon, but in his mouth was no lie. He ruled as a man, not a god." That might be the truest epitaph Alfonso ever received in today's world. His nickname might have drawn a different kind of attention. Doctors might have diagnosed a neurological disorder. Publicists might have coached his speech. History might have been kinder. But in the 13th century, there were no diagnoses, only judgment. And still, Alfonso IX held the crown for 42 years, led his people through war and reform, and passed it on in peace. Not many kings can say the same. So next time you hear about Alfonso the Slabar, remember that under the wet mouth was a dry mind, sharp as any sword, and steady as any law. He may have drooled on his scepter, but he never let it fall. Charles the Mad, the king who thought he was made of glass *, the reign of Charles VI of France, did not begin with madness. In fact, when he ascended to the throne in 1380, at the age of 11, he was affectionately known as Charles the Beloved, tall, well-built, and blessed with clear blue eyes. Charles was initially seen as a promising antidote, but as the years stretched on and the pressures of rulership began to mount, the man who had once inspired hope would come to inspire only dread and, later, pity. Charles's early years as king were guided by regents, most notably his uncle's great nobles like the Dukes of Burgundy, Berry, and Anjou. They enriched themselves at France's expense, draining the royal treasury and worsening the peasant burden. The people grew restless, and Charles, once of age, made a dramatic move to take power back. In 1388, he dismissed his uncles and reinstated the so-called marmosets, a council of competent administrators, loyal to the crown and committed to reform. For a while, France breathed easier, but in 1392, something changed. During a military expedition to Brittany, Charles suffered his first major psychotic break. A mysterious attempted assassination of one of his advisors, Olivier de Clisson, had already rattled him. Then, as the king led his troops through a forest in blazing heat, a strange, barefoot man in rags jumped in front of the royal party and screamed prophecies of doom. The man was quickly removed, but the damage had been done. Shortly afterward, Charles entered what physicians at the time could only describe as a fever of the brain. He turned on his own men, drawing his sword, and attacking them wildly, killing at least one knight. When he was finally subdued, Charles fell into a catatonic state for weeks. When he awoke, he didn't remember the event at all. This was only the beginning. In the years that followed, Charles's mental state became increasingly unstable. His episodes were marked by bouts of paranoia, delusions, and wild behavior interspersed with stretches of eerie clarity. The most infamous of these delusions involved the bizarre belief that his body was made of glass. He reportedly refused to be touched and wore reinforced clothing, including iron rods sewn into his garments, to protect himself from breaking. On some days, he remained immobile for hours, afraid that a single step might shatter his legs. On others, he screamed that he had cracked and needed to be mended. This condition, now referred to as the glass delusion, was not unique to Charles, but he became its most well-documented and tragic example. He would often have his servants tiptoe around him and instructed guards not to come too close. At times, he insisted on sitting still in complete silence, believing that any sudden motion would fracture his glass limbs. This wasn't mere eccentricity. It was paralyzing, debilitating fear, fused with the authority of kingship. The royal court was left in chaos. His queen, Isabeau of Bavaria, became the de facto ruler in his absence. But she was ill-prepared and increasingly unpopular, courtiers whispered. Nobles schemed, and France stumbled into a deeper crisis. Civil wars broke out among powerful factions like the Armagnacs and the Burgundians, each claiming to act in the king's name. But Charles could do little to stop them some days. He didn't even remember he was king. France was already being crushed under the weight of the 100 Years' War with England. Now it had a monarch who couldn't walk across the room without fearing he might shatter like a wine goblet. His fragility became symbolic of a nation fractured from within and threatened from without. But what caused Charles's descent into madness? Modern historians have suggested a variety of causes: schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, encephalitis, even the genetic effects of inbreeding, common among European royals. His father, Charles V, had suffered from intense stress and depression, and his maternal grandmother was known for her erratic behavior. Whether it was inherited illness, extreme trauma, or neurological disease, Charles's unraveling came at the worst possible moment for France. He wasn't always incoherent. In lucid moments, he reportedly wept over his own condition. He would ask, "Why do they speak of me as if I am dead? And worse, why do I not remember being king?" These flickers of awareness, so rare, so haunting, suggested that somewhere inside the shattered mind, Charles still lived. But the court had to function, and that meant managing around the monarch. His physicians bled him, his priests exorcised him, his counselors lied to him. At one point, they told him that he was not really the king and was simply mistaken just to calm him. At another, they brought him court documents that he had signed months earlier and pretended they were new, so he would believe he was still participating in government. The irony is painful. A king so feared to be made of glass that his entire kingdom had to pretend reality didn't exist for his sake and theirs. All of this might have remained a private tragedy, were it not for a single event that brought Charles's instability into the public eye in the most dangerous, humiliating way possible. It was a partia masquerade. No less, and a disaster was about to unfold. But what could possibly go wrong when a mad king, flammable costumes, and a dancing court collide? By the early 1390s, it was becoming impossible to hide the truth from the French court. King Charles VI's episodes of madness were no longer rare. They were regular. Sometimes he forgot his own name. Sometimes he wandered the palace corridors, howling like a wolf. At other times, he didn't speak for days. And still, the kingdom had to function. France was at war with England. Tax rebellions were simmering. The royal household was bloated and expensive. Nobles were growing restless. Everyone was waiting for the next disaster. It came on January 28, 1393. To celebrate the remarriage of one of Queen Isabeau's ladies-in-waiting. A grand masquerade ball was organized at the Hotel St. Paul in Paris. This was a common form of aristocratic entertainment, a break from diplomacy, a chance to dazzle, and a way to distract the king from his episodes. And for Charles, who loved pageantry and costumes, it was something to look forward to. The court needed this to go well. They needed to see their king smile. The theme was light-hearted, woodland creatures and satyrs, and Charles, never one to do anything halfway, volunteered to participate in the centerpiece performance of Wild Men Dance, a popular entertainment involving noblemen dressed in fur and acting like untamed beasts of the forest. It was supposed to be comic. 6 men would wear tight-fitting costumes made of linen soaked in pitch, resin, and flax, designed to look like animal hair. They would leap and shriek, pretending to be feral forest dwellers brought to court for the queen's amusement. There was only one problem. The costumes were highly flammable. The guests were told not to carry open flames. Torches were supposed to be extinguished or kept away from the dancers. But in the chaos and noise of the event, this rule was ignored. One noble accounts differ, but many say it was Louis, Duke of Orleans, Charles's own brother, entered the ballroom carrying a lit torch, possibly drunk, possibly looking to get a better view of the performance. As the torch drew near, one of the dancers brushed against it. The fire caught instantly. What happened next was panic, screams, the smell of burning pitch and flesh. The dancers were engulfed in flames within seconds. People rushed for water, tore off drapes, and beat at the fires with cloaks. But it was no use. 4 of the 6 dancers burned alive, shrieking and writhing on the ballroom floor. Their bodies were so charred they were unrecognizable. One man leaped into a wine vat to extinguish himself, but died of his burns later. Charles survived, but only just. A quick-thinking noblewoman, the Duchess of Berry-Days, recognized him beneath the costume and shielded him with her heavy skirts, smothering the flames before they reached his face. The king was saved, but the trauma was catastrophic. This event became known as Le Bal des Ardents, the Ball of the Burning Men. It sent shockwaves through Paris and all of France. The common people saw it as a sign of God's anger. Nobles began whispering that the king was cursed. Chroniclers recorded it in horrified tones. After all, what kind of ruler frolics in flammable madness while his kingdom crumbles? The scandal deepened. People blamed Queen Isabeau for allowing such reckless entertainment. They blamed Duke Louis for bringing a torch into a hall full of pitch-soaked nobles. But more than anyone, they blamed the mental weakness of Charles himself. A king who believed he was made of glass had nearly burned his court to death. From that point on, the court was split not just politically, but spiritually. 2 main factions emerged: the Armagnacs, loyal to Charles's son and the traditional crown, and the Burgundians, who favored reform and supported Charles's cousin, the powerful Duke of Burgundy. As Charles slipped further into his mental illness, these factions fought for control over the regency. France was no longer a kingdom with a mad king. It was a mad kingdom without a stable ruler. The king himself remained fragile. Reports described him wandering the palace, convinced he was being poisoned. He occasionally failed to recognize his wife and children. Once he saw his own reflection in a mirror and attacked it, crying out that an impostor had invaded the castle. In one moment of horror, he ordered all cats in the palace to be drowned, convinced they were demons sent to gnaw at his glass bones. Still, there were glimmers of lucidity. For weeks at a time, Charles would return to calmness, preside over council meetings, issue laws, and receive ambassadors. Then, without warning, the clouds would roll in again. His courtiers learned to read the signs: a sudden silence, a strange look, or a refusal to change his clothes for days on end. His physicians tried everything: bleedings, herbal tonics, holy relics. One even recommended using chamomile and powdered pearls, which were mixed into his wine. Nothing worked. All the while, the 100 Years' War dragged on. The English had begun pressing into northern France, and the power vacuum left by Charles's instability made it impossible for France to present a united front. The civil war between Armagnacs and Burgundians escalated into bloodshed. Assassinations, betrayals, sieges. The kingdom was unraveling, and through it all, Charles sat in his chambers, sometimes silent, sometimes babbling, sometimes sobbing. For reasons he couldn't explain, he had become a king without a crown, a ruler without a realm. But what happens when a man so fragile is forced to carry the full weight of a collapsing kingdom? Can a court survive a monarch who believes he might shatter at the touch? The answer would come in blood and in a treaty that would haunt France for generations. By the time Charles VI entered the final phase of his reign, France was no longer ruled by a king. It was managed by factions, fear, and the painful memory of what monarchy used to mean. The image of Charles stumbling through palace corridors, or cowering in a corner, convinced that a jolt might splinter his glass ribs, had become both symbol and prophecy. France itself seemed on the verge of shattering. The inner court was dominated by two viciously competing powers. On one side, the Armagnacs, who supported Charles's son, the Dauphin Charles's rightful heir to the throne. On the other, the Burgundians, led by the cunning and ruthless John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy, who sought to seize control through political manipulation and, when necessary, assassination. That moment came in 1407, when the Duke of Orleans, Charles's brother, and once a regent in all but name, was murdered on the streets of Paris. He was hacked to pieces by masked men sent by John the Fearless himself. The justification: he had become too powerful and possibly too close to the Queen. The Armagnac-Burgundian feud exploded into open war. The capital turned violent. Allegiances fractured along bloodlines, and France's nobility devolved into what was essentially gang warfare, cloaked in silk and flirtatious. And where was Charles? Now in his 40s, the once promising, beloved king was a husk. He recognized almost no one. He could no longer hold counsel for more than a few minutes without losing track of who he was speaking to. At times, he believed he was St. George. At others, he claimed to be dead already. For entire weeks, he remained mute, sitting at windows and staring into the fog over the Seine. Even in brief moments of lucidity, he seemed disoriented, almost frightened by the idea that time had passed. One of the few things Charles did understand at least vaguely was that his kingdom was no longer whole, and that his son, the Dauphin Charles, was too young and unready to claim it. The fear of total collapse led Queen Isabeau and the Burgundians to do the unthinkable in 1420. With the encouragement of England and under immense pressure from John the Fearless's successor, Philip the Good, the French crown signed the Treaty of Troyes. This treaty was a humiliation on parchment. It disinherited the Dauphin, Charles's own son, and named the English king Henry V as heir to the French throne. To make it stick, Henry was married to Charles VI's daughter, Catherine of Valois, in a union meant to fuse the crowns after Charles's death. The French people were horrified, even though many viewed the Dauphin as weak and rebellious. The idea that a French king would be replaced by an English foreigner was unthinkable. Rumors spread that Isabeau had betrayed her son to secure her own safety. Others whispered that the real Charles VI would never have agreed to such terms, suggesting that he had been forced or tricked into signing the treaty during one of his delusional episodes. But regardless of how it happened, the treaty was signed. It stood, and Charles, so fragile in body and mind, remained on the throne, a king in name only, until his death 5 years later. His final years were marked by almost constant madness. He no longer bathed. He often refused food. On rare occasions, when he spoke, he mumbled about broken limbs and cursed birds. His once bright blue eyes were sunken, and his beard grew wild and white. He was kept in soft clothes and watched by attendants around the clock to prevent him from harming himself, imagining others had the glass delusion never fully left him. Even at his lowest, Charles would occasionally ask servants if the palace had been reinforced to protect him. "I heard a crack," he once whispered to a priest, "in my knee. I think I've splintered again." When he finally died in October 1422, he was 53 years old. His funeral was not a grand affair. There was no rousing eulogy, no triumphant speeches, just a simple, tired procession for a monarch whose life had been one long unraveling. His body was laid to rest in Saint Denis, among the kings of France, though some said he never truly lived, like one dot in a cruel twist of irony. Henry V of England, named heir by the Treaty of Trowahad, died just 2 months before Charles. The throne passed to Henry VI, an infant, and so the chaos continued. The Dauphin, later Charles VII, eventually reclaimed the crown, thanks in part to the efforts of Joan of Arc. But the legacy of Charles VI lingered like a ghost. He was not a villain. He was not a tyrant. He was, in many ways, a man broken by his crown, a ruler crushed beneath the weight of expectations, bloodlines, and a brain that could not bear the burden of power. His tragedy wasn't just personal, it was national. France itself had suffered along with its king, fractured into factions, betrayed from within, and nearly handed over to foreign rule. And perhaps most poignantly of all, Charles VI left behind one enduring metaphor, the image of a monarch who believed he was made of glass, ruling over a kingdom just as fragile and just as close to breaking. Could France have survived if Charles had remained sane? Or was his madness merely the symptom of a larger disease, one that no crown, no council, and no treaty could cure?